When the Portuguese colonists first forced the local population to build Elmina Castle on the coast of what is now Ghana, they imagined that they were building a fort for all the gold they would steal out of the continent. They weren't. They were building a particle accelerator. Contemporary particle accelerators do what Western science has done without a pause since the Enlightenment period in Europe: break things apart. Also called atom smashers, large particle accelerators the size of cities now cultivate the highest velocity crash they can manage on the level of the proton, creating as many collisions as possible so that the protons will shatter each other and show the researchers and the waiting corporate funders what they are made of. Whether through collision, dissection, or the isolation of stimuli, scientific experiments break things down into pieces, ostensibly to see how they work. But in the context of capitalism, the further motivation for breaking things open is to get work out of them, the production of value for those who control the means of destruction. In the midst of the big experiment called colonialism, European monarchs adapted their practice. Instead of using their forts and castles on the western coast of Africa to merely house the minerals, especially gold, that they were extracting, they sought to add an exponent. They multiplied their resources by the factor of stolen labor. When Audre Lorde visited Elmina Castle Dungeon in 1974, she did not have a lab notebook or a ledger. What she felt in that place affected her so deeply she almost didn't write about it in her journal. Anything but poetry would dwarf it, she realized. But she did experience the residue of the collision while she was there. Old, old dreams in the stone of Elmina, she wrote. Elmina and all those other fortresses became early particle accelerators, structures of compression where colonists and their local collaborators crowded millions of kidnapped Africans into dungeons so tightly that their skin cells and excrement make the stones of Elmina smooth. A captivity so compressed that the smell of their physical suffering remains in the walls to this day. But the body matter fused into the walls is only one of the collisions. Remember, Western scientific progress requires as many collisions as possible. Transatlantic particle accelerators shattered bloodlines, shattered social contracts, shattered consciousness, shattered the bones in the arms and legs and ribs and faces of those who tried to escape, shattered language groups in order to funnel down to an individual unit of capital. The result of this matrix of collisions? One body at a time, broken into its smallest parts, no longer part of a complex social whole. The accelerator pushed the smallest component of community, of possibility, through a cramped space called the door of no return to become cargo. Today, in 3-story buildings along the round tunnel of the largest particle accelerator in the world, the Large Hadron Collider near Geneva, Switzerland, experimental physicists watch the wreckage. They cannot account for everything that happens to each of the 100 million hydrogen protons that are thrown together in the collider at one time. So they look for patterns based on the work of theoretical physicists who imagine that on the tiny scale of a proton, a small piece of an atom, they will see the structure of the entire universe. The scientists at the collider and their computers chart the ways the particles scatter and run them backwards into equations about velocity and mass, the quantification work of quantum physics. The economists of the slave trade did a similar thing. They looked at the wreckage. How many captives died from being packed together? How many kept breathing? How many became bait for sharks? How many attempted mutiny? How many gave birth? How many jumped ship? Seeking to factor theft down into its smallest components of risk and loop it back into an equation of sale or loss. Audre Lorde and Dionne Brand do not have the same accent. Why would they? The poet, novelist, filmmaker, world maker, Dionne Brand was born in Trinidad and migrated to Canada as a young adult. Audre Lorde was born in Harlem to a mother from Grenada and a father from Barbados, and only became a full-time Caribbean resident at the end of her life. So when they each say the word particular, it doesn't sound exactly the same. But if you listen to a recording of Audre Lorde saying particular, and then listen to a recording of Dionne Brand saying particular, you will hear a projectile kinship in the emphasis at the center of the word, something hard against the tongue in the T, back of the throat activated in the C, a velocity that could multiply worlds. Particular. It's a word they both use, but differently. Just months before Audre Lorde died, she wrote a letter to Adrienne Rich about the poetry she was reading and what was resonating in her spirit. Rich's new poems, of course, were beautiful, she affirmed, and she also let her friend know that there were poems by the younger poets, Essex Hemphill and Dionne Brand, that she was carrying inside me wherever I go. Where she went, less than 2 months later, was somewhere out of this life, the domain even scientists don't claim to measure, the realm of elegy, the unimaginable space where we have to trust the poets and philosophers and their imaginations. It is easy to see why Audre Lorde would hold the early poetry of Dionne Brand close, the sensuality, the attention to smell, exactly what Audre Lorde asked of her students and herself in poetry. She would have been moved by Brand's nuanced poems of witness of the revolution in Grenada that had shaken them both with hope and then devastation. She didn't live long enough to witness Brand writing her own map to the door of no return. Audre Lorde didn't leave descriptions of exactly what Dionne Brand's poetry was doing as it bounced around inside her wherever she went. Dionne Brand doesn't remember for sure if they spoke during the Poetry is Not a Luxury session at the I Am Your Sister Sella conference in honor of Audre Lorde in 1990, but she does remember that during the Third International Feminist Book Fair in Montreal in 1988, she was supposed to have lunch with Audre Lorde and a group of other feminists, but she got lost on the way there and didn't find it until it was too late. Audre was waiting for you, her friend Linda Carty said afterwards. In the accelerator, not all protons collide. Most of them pass right by each other. The probability for collision is relatively low, physicists explain, because matter is mostly empty space. But for the best chance of impact, the protons come at each other from the two sides of the collision point, organized into beams of matter, roughly the length of a pencil. In 1980, while Grenada was in the midst of their revolutionary experiment and the United States military was running models on how to destroy the revolutionary potential in Grenada, Nicaragua, and other sites, physicist Wheeler was running an experiment in particle physics that's now referred to as Which Path? Funded by, but not directly addressing, the socialism versus capitalism which path question of the Cold War, Wheeler's experiment found that after crashing into each other, subatomic particles can actually exist in more than one place at one time, and that they can in fact be more than one thing at the same time. Dionne Brand's protagonists in Another Place, Not Here draw on that possibility when they dream of an alternate reality in which they could be free. Particle physicists call it superposition. Black diaspora theorist Michelle Wright explains, this means that one cannot attempt to track a particle through linear space or time. One can only use the present moment, more specifically, the now, to determine the location of an object. Dionne Brand also went to Elmina Castle, many years after Audre Lorde. What did she find? A version of the same smell. What did she do? A small ritual. She and her group poured rum out, in acknowledgement of those who had passed through into that transatlantic collision, the door of no return. In The Blue Clerk, Brand recounts speech across generations. They said, with wonder and admiration, you are still alive, like hydrogen, like oxygen. We all stood there for some infinite time. She describes it as a form of defiance, an impossible returning of some of the genetic energy that scattered from this place during an experiment that is not over. In her public lectures and at least one private conversation, Dionne Brand makes it clear. She is a materialist. She doesn't believe there was something magical, spiritual happening when she went to Elmina. Just the fact, she says, that they were there and we are here. And then she pauses for a nanosecond. But it is quite an astonishing fact. Even though Audre Lorde was born blocks away from the underground research labs for the Manhattan Project, there is no evidence that she visited any active large-scale particle accelerators, other than Elmina Castle, in her lifetime. It is more likely that she dealt with the more intimate scattering of the small particle accelerators in hospitals, used to treat cancer with radiation. Audre avoided those treatment methods until the very end of her journey, around the time when she would have been traveling around with the poems of Dionne Brand inside her. Maybe she imagined their poetry meeting each other in her chest, her liver, her bones, everywhere the proton beams went. Maybe she could feel them, the poems she wrote and the ones she helped make possible, crashing into each other at the speed of light.